Welcome to Real Estate Investing Abundance, the show for busy, fulfilled professionals like you to learn how to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. Now, here is your host, Dr. Alan Lomax.
Hello, enlightened investors. I'm so glad to be back with you again today. Thank you for joining us for a wonderful episode on why and how our guest today helps foreign investors get access to USA real estate markets. Bernard Pierson has over 10 years of real estate experience and has invested in over 2,000 apartment units. He started his real estate career doing ground-up real estate development and is now fully focused on acquiring multifamily properties. Bernard holds a master's in real estate from Georgetown University and a real estate analysis and investment certificate from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Bernard, take us into the show and share an experience that was pivotal in helping you to be who you are today.
Hi, Doctor. Thanks for having me on today. And I was thinking about this one as I got on the show. You told me that we were going to start the show with this. And the first thing that came to my mind, and I think it's the most accurate one, and it's a very significant one. My backstory is I was born in Miami to Nicaraguan parents who had immigrated to Miami when there was a war. So when I was around 6 years old, we moved back to Nicaragua. So my parents would always tell me great things. I was 4 years old. You know, one of my earliest memories was always how great Nicaragua was and how much they loved this country. They really missed their country, right? It was their home. So we were finally going back home. We were finally moving back there when I was 5 or 6 years old, right? And I was all excited, and we were in Miami, right? And I'm now moving to this amazing place, and I'm all excited about this move. And the day comes, we move, we get on the flight, everything's going fine, excellent, right? I even took some pets I had with me, a small little bird. I was a 5-year, little things I had with me, and I was taking everything, and I was all excited, right? And my brothers were with me. My father actually stayed behind on that trip. He was coming later, but my mom was with us on the flight. So we get to Nicaragua, we land, it's night. It's the middle of the night. It was a late flight. And the first thing that happens is we get off the flight, and we don't get off on a jetway like we do here. We got off on stairs. And I'm like, okay, this is different. But again, I'm 5 years old, so it's fun. But then as soon as they get off the stairs, Nicaragua at the time was finishing a war. They were just getting past a recent civil war. So all I start seeing is all these military men dressed in military clothes and with guns around them. And these were machine guns and AK-47s, which is the weapon of choice back there. And I was like, okay, why did my parents say this was great? Right. And they lied to me. This is somebody. What's going on here? Then we go through the airport. Everything's old. It's a very poor country. So everything was falling apart. Walls weren't painted. They were this very opaque, brownish color, old wood. And it was just old. There was no AC. And we finally got to the car. The car was 20 years old easily. It was missing. There was holes in the seat. It was fabric seats, right? And they just had holes in them, and you could see all the foam. And there was a gun on the floor of the car. And I'm like, okay, the first time I see a gun in my life. I'm 5 years old, right? And then as we're driving home, there's buses with people hanging out of them. So it was a huge disappointment. But as time passed, I grew to love that country, and the perspective it's given me is I think it's very unique. For me at least, or at least with the people I'm surrounded by, as I was exposed to a level of poverty and a level of just everything was so different. I mean, we were so far behind, and that just gave me a perspective to be a lot more grateful for what we have, and especially what we have here in this country.
Yeah. Bernard, that's really interesting how it is that you were explaining that your parents were so in love with Nicaragua. So oftentimes here in the United States, we hear all of these stories of immigrants coming from Latin America. And we have this picture in our mind that they're not leaving anything behind, that they have no feelings for their country, and they come to the great United States and can't wait to get out of their countries. And I think we so often forget about the pain and agony that it takes to immigrate. And so thank you for illustrating that for us, Bernard, that in spite of the poverty and conditions that Latin America often faces, they're beautiful countries with beautiful people, and it's heartbreaking for the immigrants that are coming here. And we need to take that into consideration there. Bernard, you started out your real estate experiences in South America, but before you actually got into real estate, you were in the food trading industry and you built some wealth in conjunction with that. So share with us those experiences and why it is that you, even though you were building wealth in the food trade industry, why did you leave that?
Yeah. So Nicaragua, again, being it's a very agricultural country. And we also have there's a lot of beef, cattle, and stuff like that. So I got into the fight. It was almost coincidentally through friends and whatnot. I got into trading food and we would make good money. We would sell coffee, we would sell sugar, we would sell beef, we would sell lobster, which I still do to this day a little. I sell a little bit of lobster here and there. But we were making great money, and especially for our age. We were young back then, but it was very transactional. We would close a deal and we would have to start over, right? And we were making money. I mean, not that we were making millions, but we were making good money. But I started to get this feeling, okay, so now I have to invest this money somewhere, and I want to get a source of income that doesn't depend on me closing a deal every time. And because it was starting to create a lot of stress in my life to have to depend on a deal to make money. And that's how it just wasn't sustainable. As I looked forward, I started figuring out that we were a middleman and we were starting to get squeezed out. And eventually I could see a future where we would be squeezed out with technology and globalization. And it was just not my passion. And it was just too transactional. And that's why I found real estate and moved to real estate.
Bernard, I can understand how you could see that was transactional, but there's many people who find themselves in these various different professions. I mean, real estate brokers are one excellent example of that. It's extraordinarily transactional business, and yet the vast majority of realtors would never even think of going into real estate investment. What led you, or what gave you the insight to understand that you needed to do something besides transactional?
I knew that it wasn't healthy that my income would depend on my hours, right, or on my input into my business. That eventually I may want to, thinking very ahead of the future, I may want to retire, or even thinking shorter term, I may have some condition at some point that may not allow me to work the way I was working before. I may not be able to travel as easily. And all these things made me in a way nervous. And as I researched, I did find real estate, and yeah, they sell you this. A lot of real estate investors out there or companies sell you or pitch you this idea that real estate is passive. It's not. It usually is not, right? It can also be transactional, but I think you can find ways for it to be sustainable at least, and provide a sustainable source of income.
Some amazing insights for a very young man living in an impoverished country. So it's kind of amazing that you actually came to those. And yes, there is so much hype in the real estate industry that it's passive income and you never have to do anything. Just place your investment there and you're instantly a millionaire. But it doesn't happen that way. But the thing about it is, even though if you are really going to develop wealth through real estate, it definitely is. As you're starting out on it, it is almost always going to be a transactional endeavor, but it is a way to develop wealth.
Yes. And the other thing is that we talk a lot about the income side of real estate and the passive income side, but there's also a big piece that I've seen through my years in real estate that people don't really talk about as much is it's a great way to create wealth. Like the amount of equity you can create in real estate if you're patient is very hard to match elsewhere with the same level of risk.
Absolutely. And it is that development of equity where that passive income comes from. But nobody I know of starts off with a great deal of equity. It takes time and it takes transactions and activity to do that. Bernard, it's interesting to me that you began your real estate endeavors in Latin America, and I guess it was in Nicaragua. And that to me is a little bit surprising given the instabilities in Nicaragua and the extreme poverty and all of that. How were you able to start your real estate endeavors in Nicaragua?
So it was Nicaragua and it was also Costa Rica. But the reason that happened was I had already started getting interested in real estate. I had already bought my first investment property. And I was already, at that time, I was probably in a little bit of analysis paralysis, although I had taken the first step of buying a property. I ended up finding a partner that we're still great friends today, and we're still looking at work together today. But they had a lot of experience. Their family had been developing for 40 years or so. And one of the things that gave me a lot of comfort was to go into the business with someone who had experience, right? And that just made everything. It just gave me a lot of comfort, and it's something I would recommend a lot of people to do, right? If you're going to get into this business, try to do it with someone who has experience. So I found those guys, and we did that. And the other thing that made sense to me was I knew Nicaragua, or I know Nicaragua very well. It's home. I know the people, I know the culture, I know the city very well. I know everything. I mean, my network over there was at the time, at least, a lot bigger than it is here. And it's a small country. Everyone knows each other. So it made a lot of sense at the time. And yeah, it was a great experience. I think it was a great learning experience. In the end, I decided to change paths, but at the time, I thought it made sense. And that's why I ended up doing that.
Well, as you alluded to here, Bernard, you actually did change paths and you moved your investment endeavors here to the USA. What brought you to that decision? Why did you decide to move your endeavors here?
There's a lot of reasons to that. I'll start off by saying that a couple of years into development, we would have developed condos and condo buildings and communities of single family homes. And the concept of multifamily for rent or built for rent does not really exist in Latin America as much. So, or at all, maybe. So we would sell them, right? These were all for sale. And I quickly found out in a couple of years that I'm again in a transactional environment, right? I have to build and now I have to sell it, right? So I'm, as you were saying before, but the real estate brokers and all the different roles we can play in real estate, a lot of them are transactional, and I found myself in a transactional one. But I also started finding out that I was when I first got in, Nicaragua was kind of, the economy was growing, things were going very well. And then about 4 years ago in 2018, we had a big political, social unrest episode of that, and things never really recovered after that. And it happened from one day to the other. And that made me realize how fragile these countries can be and how risky they are. And I did a lot of studies, and I like to look at data, and I'm very analytical. So I started looking at different data points, and I started finding out that if I want to summarize it, the risk-adjusted return of investing in Nicaragua, and even Latin America for that sense, is inferior than in the US. So, and in most cases, right? I'm not saying that there's no opportunities in Latin America. There are. But in general, you can do a lot better here in the US, at least if you look back. And part of the reason that I started looking at that is while I was developing, I was already investing passively in real estate as what we call LP or limited partners in other syndications. And they were doing great, right? And we were doing well, but I was making, the returns were comparable as an LP versus me really fighting or really struggling. It's a struggle down there to do business in general. There's a lot of things you can't even think of that you wouldn't encounter here, or maybe probably not encounter as much here in the US. So yeah, I just started studying it. I found out that I realized how small our economy is in Nicaragua and in Costa Rica. I started looking at numbers, and if you look at and these numbers are probably a little old, like 2 years old or something, but the GDP of Latin America, for example, at the time when I was looking at these numbers was 4.7 trillion, right? So the whole continent, and that includes all Latin America, Central America, South America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. While the US at the time was around 21 trillion, right? And so we're talking about 5 times the economy, right? The size of the economy is 5 times as much. And at the same time, the population of Latin America is twice as much. So, you know,
know that. Yeah.
Yeah. So the economy is 4 times bigger here than in the whole continent with half the population. So just think about that for a little. And then I started looking at Nicaragua and Costa Rica specifically, and the economy of Nicaragua at the time was around 12.5 billion. And Costa Rica was around 61, 62 billion. Colombia, as an example of a bigger economy in Latin America, it's 270 billion.
Mm.
Then Miami, which is the city we're all most familiar with in Latin America, the metropolitan area is 300 billion. So
Wow.
just Miami is bigger than Colombia, which is one of the strongest, not today, right? But at least one of the biggest economies in Latin America. So just one city, just one MSA has a larger economy than the whole continent, or the whole region at least. And then I started looking at returns, right? And public data is hard to find there. And also here in the US, it's not as easy. So if you go to the public markets, which was easier, right? And I started looking at different real estate indices. And if I compare the one I looked at was the MSCI Emerging Markets Latin America Real Estate Index compared it to the MSCI USA IMI Real Estate Index. So if you compare those two indexes over 10 years, the return in Latin America was just under 8%, 7.9% over 10 years annual, right? And during that same period, the US was 9.6%. So the return was higher over 10 years. Okay, now let's look at the risk. What was my next step? I looked at and to keep it simple, I talk about standard deviation, which is a measure of risk. I hope I'm not losing everyone here, but
It's a little over my head, but you're giving us a general idea here.
But so the standard deviation in Latin America was 29%. That's a measure of risk, right? The higher the standard deviation, the more risk. So over the same time period, Latin America had a standard deviation of 29%. The US had a standard deviation of around 15%.
Mm.
So also almost half the risk for better return. Then if I keep on, this is the last one I'm going to say with numbers is CBRE did a study in 2019 where they studied the spread between government bonds and cap rates in Mexico and the US. And Mexico, again, is one of the sophisticated economies of Latin America. If you go to other countries, they're a lot less sophisticated. So the spread, and this has changed now, right? It's in the US, but the spread back then between cap rates and government bonds was 460 basis points in the US. In Mexico, it was 200 basis points. So there's a lot of people think that there's a lot of opportunity in Latin America, and there is, but it's not easy to find. And in general, the conditions are just not as easy to do business or as favorable as they are here. And there's the lending, the interest rates are a lot higher. I mean, we think right now that 5 or 6% interest rates are high here. Well, we would pay 12, right? 5 years ago in Nicaragua. So, I mean, that's just some of the reasons I decided to move here.
Bernard, lots of great insight there. And you have a lot to offer. So share with our viewers and listeners how it is that they can take advantage of your wisdom and knowledge and get in touch with you.
So you can sign up for my newsletter. I try to put out as much information on the subject as possible. I generally cater towards Latin American investors. And that also includes domestic Latin Americans. And what I mean by domestic is maybe Latin American families or individuals who have migrated to the US in the last, 10 years or so. And so, you can go to my website, www.equitypartners.com. And we spell equity with an I at the end, EQUITI. That I stands for international. And you can sign up for my newsletter there. You can also reach out by email, info@equitypartners.com. And if you reach out to me, I can send you some studies I've done on comparing Latin America to the US, some papers I've wrote and whatnot. And I can share all that stuff with you. So do reach out. And I'm also on all social media channels, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. If you reach out there and send me a private message, I'll definitely respond.
Of course, all of this is going to be in the show notes. Another way and means that you can contact Bernard is info@equitypartners.com and send them an email, and in the subject line, enter abundance. And they will send you a free guide on real estate investing in both Spanish and English. Bernard, how is it that you and your company are helping foreign investors get access to USA markets? So
for foreign investors, it's a very foreign, for environment to come invest in the US. When they think about the US, they think about Miami, they think about New York, and maybe parts of Texas, California, all these major cities. And the rest of the country is just very foreign to them. So I just help them give back. I educate them in Spanish. I'm not the only one, but there's not a lot of Spanish speaking multifamily experienced operators. So that is probably one of the most significant way I can help. I understand their culture, I understand their language, and I can communicate it to them in a way that if you don't speak Spanish, you won't be able to communicate it. And the translating the real estate lingo to, especially the one we use here with cap rates and whatnot, it's not easy to Spanish. It's not, even if you know the language, it's not easy. And one of the main reasons is, as I was saying before, is the multifamily concept is very foreign to us. It does not exist. We have apartment buildings. Apartment buildings are typically condos. The concept of cap rates doesn't really exist in most of Latin America. It's more everything, even if it's commercial real estate, it gets sold on comps, and it's just a very foreign subject for us. Mm-hmm. So I help them understand it. I travel there and I talk to them about it, educate them. And whenever they come here to the US, I also educate them and speak at conferences in Spanish. And that's what I do. And I also help them invest, right? They're not here, they're far away. So I help them. We find the deals, we set them up, we syndicate them. And most of our investors are from Latin America. Not exclusively. We do take domestic investors as well, but most of our investors are from Latin America.
Bernard, what you've been telling me about the lack of multifamily rentals in Nicaragua is really surprising to me. I would have expected it would have been just the opposite, that most people in Nicaragua are not property owners, but are renters. So this is really quite surprising to me. That
well, there's a mix. There's some aren't going to be like the very low class or the very poor individuals. Those are probably going to own more than rent because they're so poor they can't afford to rent, right? So they probably own a small parcel of land, and they figured out a way to build their own house. Or some sort of shelter on that parcel of land. Yeah. Or there are some government programs. Are they efficient or not? Well, that's another conversation. But there are some government programs that have given the poorest of the country access to shelter. So and there are rentals. It's just not a multifamily or apartment building like we see here. It's more someone buys a property and they rent it out. Someone buys a house and they rent it out. Someone buys a condo and they rent it out. But it's not a 50-unit garden-style apartment community where all the units get rented out. There are a couple, very few, very hard to find, very few. There's not a strong market for it. You're not going to be able to sell it easily. There's appraisals aren't even going to know how to value it because there's no, just the cap rate concept does not exist, or it's very foreign to us down there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, interesting. Well, what are the major benefits to investors who are either foreign or they're just newly arriving in the country as immigrants?
So I think there's many that we all know and we talk about all the time. And those also apply. It's going to be taxes, diversification, et cetera, right? But I think one big one, if you just came to this country, is if you invest passively or even actively, it's an alternative income stream, right? You're coming to a new country, you're maybe have a new job, you're maybe starting a new business. Well, you can passively get alternative streams of income. If you come to this country, if you stay over there, well, then you can also have alternative streams of income. The other big benefit for individuals, especially from Latin America, is going to be, if you think inflation is bad here, you should go down there to go to Colombia, go to Peru, go to Chile. Right. I mean, if you look at the dollar right now, compared to their currency, it's gained a lot of strength. And that has translated to inflation in their country as well, right? Everything's gotten more expensive. They have to import. They depend a lot on imports. So everything's more expensive there. And a lot of these countries are going through strong, or the word's not strong, but significant political changes towards, in some cases, towards the left. And that's created fear for them. And historically, Latin America, governments that goes towards the left also become authoritarian, right? So they're very nervous. And what they want is to take the money out. That's what they want. They want to have assets outside of their country. And I think that's one of the best benefits. You're going to be in US dollars. Your asset's going to be here in the US. It's going to be protected. They're not going to take it away from you as they would in another country where you can just lose it. Yeah. And I think that's just the best benefit that they can have is you're going to take your money out. It's not going to be sitting in a bank account. It's going to be here in the US. It's going to be well protected, and you're going to be making money off of it and And I think it's also, as I said it before, just the risk adjusted returns of investing down there versus here and just getting that diversification of a lot of them have businesses in Latin America, or maybe they have their employment down there or something. And so they depend a lot on that local economy. So I think it's key for them, or it's great for them. It's very valuable for them to diversify into this economy, which is the strongest in the world.
Enlightened investors, I've certainly enjoyed the conversation today, and I know that you have as well. And what a fascinating take on international opportunities and investments, and how it is that people outside of the United States can actually take advantage of the investment opportunities that are here. I look forward to being with you in the future, enlightened investors. Next episode coming up in 3 days. So be with us then. Bernard, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Doctor. It was a pleasure. Had a lot of fun.
Thank you for tuning in to Real Estate Investing Abundance, brought to you by Steve Talker Capital, a company working for passionate professionals like you to develop financial independence built on solid, passive real estate investments. As part of our efforts to make the world a better place, Steve Talker Capital contributes to activities and organizations committed to better understand the equine. These endeavors attempt to enhance the human treatment of horses worldwide. Steve Talker Capital, working for a world where all creatures, great and small, flourish abundantly. For resources to develop your financial independence, connect with us at stevetalker.com.